Today's video answers the question, is there a correct shutter speed setting for video? Well, the short answer is yes and no. The camera's shutter speed affects the brightness of the shot and the amount of motion blur. The lower the shutter speed, the longer the shutter stays open, allowing more light to hit the sensor, and the longer the shutter is exposed for, the more motion blur will be present. For the majority of your filming, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So, if you're filming at 25 frames per second, your shutter speed, which is displayed as a fraction, should be set to 50. This means each frame will be exposed for 1/50th of a second. If you're filming at 50 frames per second, your shutter speed will be 100, and so on. This concept is also known as the 180-degree rule. Following this rule mimics the amount of motion blur that our eye naturally sees. However, aren't rules made to be broken? In this video, I'm going to show you what happens when you adjust your shutter speed and some cool effects that you can create if you choose to bend the rules. For this video, I took a little excursion to Budrum Falls on the Sunshine Coast. I've always loved taking long exposure photos, especially of waterfalls, but I never tried to create a video version of these kinds of shots. My ultimate goal was to create this, but it wasn't quite as easy as I originally thought it would be. This all started out as a fun experiment for myself, but I thought I would take you along for the ride and show you how I eventually got my end result. When you bring your shutter speed down this low, you are definitely going to need an ND or neutral density filter. This is basically sunglasses for your lens. Even if you're doing standard filming at shutter speed 50, when you're outside during the day, it's a great tool to have in your kit because it gives you a lot more leeway with your aperture, so you're not sacrificing shallow depth of field or cranking your shutter speed insanely high to get your shot exposed correctly. For this first shot, I had my aperture set to 7.1 because I wanted the entire image to look sharp. I had my ISO set as low as possible on 100, and with my ND filter on the darkest setting possible, I was able to get my shutter speed down to 4. And this was the result. Not exactly the smooth, buttery, dreamy waterfall look we were aiming for. Yet. To get this look, we need to do a little bit of work in post. So let's head into the edit suite and I'll show you the steps I had to go through to get from this to this. The first thing I did was increase the speed of the shot to 400%. Still, it looks pretty clunky. So here's the real trick. I duplicated it, turned the opacity down to 20% and offset it by 1 frame. I then duplicated this shot again and again and continued to offset them by 1 frame 5 times. Have a look at the result now. Another way that you might see this effect used is to show that a character is a bit out of it, or in some kind of trance. Or you could even go point of view style where they've had a bit too much to drink. This effect can be achieved really simply by lowering your shutter speed to around 20 or below, and no extra work in post is required. Now I'll show you what happens when you do the reverse and increase your shutter speed. It's far less obvious when you use a higher shutter speed compared to a low shutter speed, and I know some videographers actually prefer using a high shutter speed to make their footage look crisper or even to pull stills from their footage, which you can't always do at shutter speed 50 because the individual frames are just too blurry. Let's look at an example. These two shots side by side look quite similar. The left-hand image, set at our standard shutter speed of 50 at 25 frames per second, has some slight visible motion blur, while the right-hand image, set at 2000, has next to none. It becomes more obvious as the water flows over the rocks, and you'll see if we pause the video, the right hand image is very crisp, while the left hand one has a small amount of motion blur. A higher shutter speed is also often used for intense action sequences or to create that feeling of drama. That too fluid, almost jerky look can work really well for fight sequences or action montages or anything that you want that impact and that fast intensity in your shot. Now that you understand the rules, deciding which shutter speed to use comes back to personal preference. But the higher your shutter speed, the further away your image gets from being that true to eye cinematic look. So I would recommend for the majority of your filming, stick to the 180-degree rule. I'd love to know your thoughts on what shutter speed setting you like to use best. And if you feel inspired to go out and experiment with some slow shutter speed shots for yourself, I would love to see what you create. It was definitely a lot of fun, and I can't wait for an excuse to use this technique in another project. Make sure you hit subscribe and let me know what you'd like to see a video about next. Check out these videos for more camera tips and techniques, and I'll see you next time.